Welcome to Reaction Norm. My name is Patricia Vino, and I am joined this week by Michael McConkey. Say hello, Michael.
Hello. Hello.
And also our good friend, Charles. Hi, Charles. How are you this morning?
I'm very jet lagged.
Oh, that's true. Yes, Charles is... what time is it in your head right now?
I think it's supposed to be about a 12 or 11 hour difference. But with the flights, I actually have no idea now.
All right. Well, you're going to do your best and stick with us. We have a good episode in store for you today. At least I hope, because I'm the one hosting it, so I also might be biased. We're going to talk about domestication today. The inspiration for this episode is a fabulous book that I read called How to Tame a Fox. I'll show you the cover here. Lovely. This book is, so the full title is How to Tame a Fox and Build a Dog, Visionary Scientists and a Siberian Tale of Jump-Started Evolution. It's by Lee Allen Dugatin and Ludmila Tront. Sorry, stumbled through Russian names, but that's okay. Anyways, this book, I just finished it recently, is a book about the Siberian fox experiments that have been running since 1959 and continue on today. And these experiments are how we learned a lot about animal domestication, and that might have some implications for humans and human evolution. So does that sound good, guys?
Yeah, sounds great.
Yep.
All
Excellent.
right. So the fox experiment is something that's been just a personal interest of me. I feel like, so the three of us are a member of a book club, and we all, I would say, have some of our favorite stories about evolution or, anecdotes that we like to share. And mine has always been the experiment about these Siberian foxes. And so I was delighted when a full book that really gets into like a lot of the detail of the characters that were involved in this experiment and the outcomes. And I would just highly recommend it. Not only is it really interesting historically, the experiments were started during Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union, which Michael and I had discussed in a previous episode. It was just a hard time to carry out any sort of genetic research in the Soviet Union. So you get a lot of different layers to it. There's people, the scientists covertly carrying out their experiments just for, I would say, the drive to do pure science, and that's very exciting. And so we learned a lot about domestication through that. Should I summarize the book a little bit more? I feel like I'm rambling a little bit.
No. I think a summary of the book would be
okay.
Good.
A summary of the book.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So pretty much, there's the main scientist, which is Dmitry Belyaev. I'm sorry. I'm gonna do my best with the names for this. And so this was he was a geneticist in the Soviet Union, and under Lysenkoism, it was pretty much, you can look back at which episode was that we did, Michael, that we talked a little bit about Lysenkoism? Was that in the Noah Carl episode? I believe it was.
I think it may have come up a couple of times, but I think that was one of them. Yeah.
Right. So this, they were throwing geneticists in jail if you didn't sort of toe the line of Soviet politics, which is basically Lamarckian use and disuse. So their idea was that, if you froze seeds, and they would do better, like trying to grow in a very northern climate. So Dmitry Belyaev had this idea that he wanted to study domestication, but he was kind of on the wrong side of Stalin and Lysenko. So he pretty much went to Siberia and started this fox farm, and he was secretly carrying out his experiments. It was under the guise that they were working on fur production. Foxes were held in captivity for a long time, and they were sort of raising them so that they could sell their furs, which were very in high demand. So the idea is, he's like, I'm carrying out these breeding experiments to try and get more production or more furs or make nicer furs. So they sort of let him do his thing, but secretly he was studying domestication. And the spoiler is that they effectively were able to domesticate these silver foxes, and they became very dog-like. They changed a lot of, so their mannerisms became very dog-like, things that foxes never do in the wild or do in captivity, and bonded with, so they basically bonded with people. They had a lot of changes in their looks, in their behaviors. And yeah, so that was maybe a brief summary, and I can get into a little bit more some of the specifics of what happened with the foxes. But did you guys have anything you wanted to jump in and say as we go? Or
I wanted to kind of ask a question, because I think you're the only one that read the book here. Did they define domestication?
Ooh, we're going to get into this. So this is a really difficult thing. So let me talk just really briefly about just a couple other points from the book, and then we'll probably venture off from the book and talk about some of these questions of what domestication is. So the fox pups, they basically turned into like little dogs. So they would, let me get into a little bit the process of how they domesticated these dogs. So they started with a whole bunch of foxes. I said dogs, I'm talking about foxes only. So every generation, they would take all these foxes, and they started very rudimentary. So they decided that they were going to selectively breed foxes based only on one trait, and that was tameness. And the way that they did this, so every fox was in its little pen, and they would put in a gloved arm, and most often a fox would just straight up attack the arm, but every once in a while they would get a fox who would neither it would attack or it would recoil and be very afraid of the human. Some would just sit and sort of watch quietly, and every once in a while you might get a fox that would curiously approach the arm. So that was sort of the first litmus test, and they took the foxes that would approach your arm and maybe smell it and seem curious, and they would start to breed those.
Okay,
and
so just one thing. It sounds like what you were describing is the fight, flight, or freeze response. So it's basically like, does the fox have a fight, flight, or freeze response? It sounds like most of the time there's a fight response, or does it get curious and come up and sniff the arm?
Yes, exactly. And so as they began identifying these foxes that were a little bit more docile and a little bit more tame, they would breed them together and just continue doing this every generation until they got foxes that eventually moved into a home with people, that were very affectionate, that would wag their tail whenever they saw a person approaching. They would follow them around on a leash or even off leash with humans. They would make eye contact with humans. And then a lot of the changes that happened in sort of their looks is that they had a smaller head, they had a smaller brain, they had much different color patterns, they had smaller teeth, they became much more playful, and even into their kind of held on to juvenile features much longer into adulthood. They were able to mate more than once a year. So these were a lot of sort of the things that happened, but note that the only thing that they were selectively breeding was always just for tameness. And as the foxes did become more tame, it became a much more like complicated scale, how they would assess the foxes and decide which ones were sort of the elite tame foxes and then breed them. And so Balyeyev's suspicion was that this process was, he called it destabilizing selection. So the idea was natural selection had honed a stable process through which foxes grew and developed in the wild. Captive foxes were very predictable developmentally. They would know what day they would open their eyes after they were born, when they'd begin exploring outside the den, when they reached sexual maturity, almost like to the day of when they would start to breed and when they would deliver their pups and whatnot. And so his theory was that even though they had just been selecting for tameness, it destabilized a number of physiological processes in the fox that also came with it destabilized this process so that a number of other related characteristics of the foxes were changed, and that these all had a genetic basis. The foxes weren't being selected for like different coat colors or this or not. So the idea was that with domestication, a lot of these traits sort of came along for the ride that were present in the genotype, but not necessarily selected for, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm curious, and this might begin to lead us in the direction of what this means for thinking about humans. You said that they had the more domesticated foxes had smaller heads and brains. Was there a discernible difference in terms of cognitive functioning, intelligence, or any of that kind of thing?
They actually thought in a number of experiments that the foxes seemed much more able to figure out what a human was trying to communicate to it. So they would do studies where they would put food under like a little like cup or something, and most animals, and even I think like chimps, like you can point at it all you want and they don't necessarily understand gestures very well, but dogs understand human gestures and what humans are looking at and what they're pointing at very instinctively, and the foxes began to pick up on behaviors like that. So it did seem, I don't know if that's like truly a good measure of intelligence, but it did seem that they were better able to understand what humans were trying to communicate to them.
That might be a function of just attention, though. It might not be like strictly intelligence.
Right. It could be. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question a little bit, but.
Well, it actually raises an additional question in that there's my understanding is the assumption has been that humans and dogs have this extremely long history of coevolution. I think it's now. I think if you go look at like Wikipedia or something, I think it would say like 13,000 years. But my understanding is that new research suggests that it's closer to 30,000 years that humans and dogs have actually co-evolved. So it's interesting that in a relatively short period of time, you can get these sort of dog-like dimensions from the foxes through this sort of selective breeding.
Exactly. This was one of the huge, I think, very surprising things about this experiment is it was expected to take many, many hundreds of generations, and a lot of these traits emerged in like fewer than 100. So should we take a stab at defining what exactly domestication is? This is sort of a process that they observed, and then it was actually much more dicey to define domestication than I thought. Do any of you guys want to take a stab at it? Do you have any ideas of what?
Well, I mean, that's like a key point. And that's why I asked that question. Like, did they try to define it? Because most people seem to use in a very squishy kind of way where they're never really clear what they mean. Right. So you might start off and say, oh, well, look at this dog compared to a wolf. Look at this, duck that's been in the farm for many generations versus the wild ducks. Look at this, this farm sheep versus, the wild sheep. Same thing with camels. Same thing with horses. Same thing with all this stuff. They seem different, right? And some of these specific animals are different in specific ways. For example, if you look at dairy cows, their production of milk is elevated, where you're not going to see that in a dog, for example, right?
Right.
So some of the stuff that it seems we've selected some of these animals for is not shared across these different animals we might, want to call domesticated. Then what's common, right? And it seems like the tameness is one of them sometimes. There are farm animals that I think are not as tame as others. I think like male bulls, like the cow bulls that are on farms aren't as tame as you want them to be necessarily. But
I think that they're still far more tame than if you went back to like those ancestral or they like aurochs that I think cows were domesticated from. Like it would still be far more tame than probably like its wild correlated.
Yeah. So then if you started there, you might just try to define it that way. Like maybe it's the tameness is the commonality that we define as domestication, right?
Right. And there's actually a term for that. It's called domestication syndrome. So you could just define it as sort of what suite of traits you see from animals that have been domesticated.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I first heard of the domestication syndrome when the paper on the the neural crest came out. I don't think I've heard of it before that, but it's getting a little ahead of ourselves. Okay, so you get into tameness, right? And then if you want to be a little more precise, you might say, okay, well, in many animals, we observe what we call a fight, flight, or freeze response. So, say something surprising happens. Do you fight it? Do you do flight? Do you run away? Or do you just freeze, right? Like, oh, it's an animal. Hopefully you won't see me, like an opossum that plays dead or something like that. Do you have that response, or like one of those three responses, or not? Right. And
I mean, there would be plenty of animals that exist in nature that don't have that have different responses. Like, I mean, it's fight or flight, but I mean, some animals like only fight ever.
Yeah.
Some animals so.
Yeah, I just meant in the sense that I'm kind of like collectively putting those together, the fight, flight, or freeze response.
Right.
So like, does the animal exhibit that kind of behavior, or does it not, in situations where you might expect other animals to? And maybe that's how you start with defining being tame, right? I think, like, I remember, like, this tame silver fox, I found it fascinating. I got exposed to it, I think, in the mid 2000s or something like that. I thought it was like quite interesting. And I remember eventually, and if I'm getting ahead of myself and you want me to like,
no, it's fine.
Yeah, I remember eventually they had a sense of maybe what's causing this. And it seemed to be that it was playing with adrenaline, right? It was basically, I think, down regulating adrenaline production. And it was doing this by means of the pituitary gland. And what it seemed like is by playing around with the pituitary gland, it affected many other chemical pathways. And it seemed to affect the developments of the creature. And I think some of this, the effects was, it could change the color of the animal. And this is where you get into like, well, you weren't selecting for like a different coat. And it wasn't, you weren't selecting for that. You were selecting for, lower adrenaline, even though you might have not thought that. But the mechanism by which it did it seemed to be through the pituitary gland. And by playing around with the pituitary gland, you also affected a lot of other things. And those other things affected things like coat colorings and pigmentation and all that other stuff.
Right. Yeah, this is part of why the book is such a fascinating read, and I would recommend it, is that as they were doing this experiment and getting findings, I mean, this was started in 1959, right? Like, we had like only the most like basic idea of even like what genetics was. So I think that like some of the earliest things that they started to explore was like the changes in hormones, because they had a way to measure that. But then as the experiment has progressed, now they can look at sort of the genetics and what genes seem to be like associated with domestication. But it seems like what you're describing, so I mean, this is the thing, it's a lot of people describe domestication as sort of these traits that we tend to get in animals. But I mean, we also would say that we domesticate plants. I mean, could you say that some animals have domesticated other animals? Like, it seems like it's difficult to get a really good definition if you're just going to describe like the traits of, and I'm not criticizing you, Charles, this is exactly, a lot of people describe exactly as you have, but there's problems, right?
Yeah. So so you could step back a bit and say that humans and other animals like ants, they have affected, I don't know if deliberately is the right word, but they've like, let's just say like more directly, and I know that's very vague and ambiguous, but like more directly affected the selection on animals, right? So humans have done this to another number of animals. Humans have done this to a number of plants, but also, ants have done this, I think, to aphids and maybe to fungus also.
Yeah, I was hoping, do you want to explain that one? I mean, I'm familiar with the fungus one, not the aphid one, if you just want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think aphids produce a kind of nectar from their butts or something like that. And I think the ants collect that. So I think it's kind of like they treat the aphids like cows almost. But I think aphids are clones. Like, I'm not 100% sure, but I think they're clones, which is kind of interesting. But I mean, they're doing something similar to humans, right?
Right.
Although like the mechanisms which ants kind of organize is a bit different, although there's analogies between
we don't need to get into that.
Okay.
Yeah. No, what I was going to say is like the leaf cutter ants, they don't eat the leaves that they cut. They cut the leaves and bring it back so that a fungus rots the leaf, and then they eat the fungus. And I don't think that this fungus is really found too many other places besides in these ant colonies. So the argument would be that ants have domesticated this fungus.
Yeah. So I mean, if you want to define, for example, domestication as maybe some kind of maybe symbiotic relationship where one organism has really affected selection on the other organism. It's probably also often it's like mutual, right? Like each one has affected each other.
Right.
If you could define it that way, but then you're kind of stepping away from the tameness, right? And
yes.
So I mean, like we've done all sorts of things to like different animals. Like if you look at, I think chickens, they're really big compared to I think what they used to be. And like I said before, dairy cows, we've caused them to produce milk at large levels. Chickens also the ones to produce eggs. I think they produce eggs quite frequently compared to what they do in the wild. I don't know if this is correct, but I think it's maybe daily compared to monthly or something like that.
Right.
So we affect them in different ways. But if you're trying to get to a commonality, it might be the tameness. Just one other point I wanted to add. I know there's a bit of debate over, how you kind of define domestication, right? One thing that I've heard some people argue is necessary is extending the imprinting period of the organism, right? So basically, when the organism is young, it's going to imprint on something it considers maybe a parent or a family member, and it'll act altruistically towards that, whatever it imprints on. And for example, for dogs, I think you handle them in the first few weeks or something like that, and they imprint on you, and they're very altruistic to you. But that seems to be necessary. But to make that easier, it seems that one thing that's changed with some of these domestic animals is that imprinting period has been extended, right?
Right.
So it might be that, okay, well, there's this, there's basically a suppression of the fight, flight, or freeze response, but it might be also, okay, it's that plus an extended imprinting period.
Right. Can I
No.
share
Okay.
one? Can I share one definition that I came across that I'm inclined to like? So this is from it's an archaeologist zoologist. How would you say that? I can't even say the word. Archaeozoologist or something. Anyway, yeah, we're gonna go with that. Juliet Clutton Brock. She, in her history, A Natural History of Domesticated Mammals, gives the following definition. A domesticated animal is, quote, bred in captivity for the purposes of sustenance or profit in a human community that controls its breeding, its organization of its territory, and its food supply.
I mean, that's a definition. I don't know if that's the one that's helpful in this conversation. Like if you took a wild animal that hadn't been with humans and just like stuck in that condition, I think that would fit her definition. But or even like the first couple of generations too. But those type of animals probably don't have the same characteristics which we might stereotypically associate with what we would consider a domestic animal. Just like in terms of this, like what's relevant for this conversation.
Right.
So I have a I don't know, a question or something, observation. So I think that often if people like if I hear the term domestication sort of just in general, and I know we're going to turn eventually to talking about how this applies to humans, and when I think that when people hear that apply to humans, they're usually thinking in terms of the sort of that Charles was referring to, but that definition that you gave, Patricia, and I think it's an interesting definition, but it then raises a question about how do you describe animals that we are in control of in that kind of way that we actually breed to make more violent. Like we breed animals like cocks and dogs to actually fight. Now, this is illegal in a lot of places, but it still happens, right? So if you're breeding something to make it more violent, more aggressive, I mean, it's not tame, but it is still kind of domesticated too, right? I mean, according to that definition.
I mean, the irony is you took something that was probably quite violent and then you selected for tameness and then you changed your mind and tried to like nudge it back the other direction.
Yeah.
With dogs, right?
Like, right, but this is dogs that are bred to fight or cocks that are bred to fight are still, would we not still describe them as domesticated insofar as they're under the control of, human selection, artificial selection?
Right. So this is, yeah. And actually, I think that you're kind of making my point, is that I think that domestication has come to mean sort of something being tame or docile, which isn't really what it is.
Well,
I mean, it's something that happens, and that's what what we have selected for in most animals, but I don't think that that's actually a great definition. It can be our working definition, that's fine. I just think that people need to not use this term quite so loosey-goosey.
Yeah, no, I think I think that's, like I said, I would have always gone towards this sort of tame version of the definition that Charles was given earlier. But the more you guys talk about this, the more I think that that's really not an adequate definition.
Right.
Which makes it interesting when you're going to start applying this to humans, right?
Right. And so my whole issue then, this is like the part 2. So to me, a really crucial part of domestication is that you have 2 species. Got a domesticator and a domesticatee. I don't even know if that's a word, but the thing that's being domesticated and the things that's domesticating. So then you always hear this sort of talk of humans self-domesticating. And now I'm like, this does not make any sense to me. So if you want to talk about humans becoming more tame, that's fine. But I just feel like this term domestication is really loaded.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that humans are domesticated. I guess we should go more into that.
This sounds like a problem. It sounds like we might all agree. So.
Yeah,
how we're going to actually discuss this.
I mean, like we have these 2 definitions, right? I mean, on one hand, and I mean, it might be that, like when you talk about a lot of things, there's different ways you can define it, and each of those definitions are worthwhile discussing, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the one hand, we have the tameness, and we kind of have a sense like, okay, there's something going on here with adrenaline. There's also maybe an extension of the imprinting period. Okay, there's that kind of domestication, right? And there's another way you could define domestication. It's just like artificial selection, if you want to call it that way. And then it's, humans affecting the selection of other humans. It's like, okay, well, no kidding. That's probably not a very interesting way of looking at it. It's just not helpful. I think a lot of people are talking about the tameness when they talk about humans self-domesticating themselves.
Right.
And if that's the case, then we can have a discussion with that. Like, I'm not convinced that's the case. Humans, I mean, they seem to exhibit, for example, even if you get in the kind of like the Christopher Bowman type sense, egalitarianism with reverse dominance hierarchy. And I know there's debate whether like that really adequately describes humans or not, but there's still aggression there. There's still like dominance, and there's like it's not that you have a lack of it; it's that it's different in nature.
Right. I've got a few things to say, Michael. Why don't you? I've been completely monopolizing all the conversation, so why don't you go ahead?
No, so I read the book and you have a lot to say, and I'm interested in what you're saying. But I just wanted to say we've started a discussion from a critical, explaining to people what the argument actually is. And I don't claim to be an expert on it, so you guys feel free to correct me or to add anything you want to add. But so I think the argument is that something along the lines, and I think Steven Pinker makes this kind of argument in Better Angels. I haven't actually read Better Angels. I mean, I already knew the facts of the case. I didn't need to read his book. But my understanding is that he makes an argument along these lines, is that as you see across history, you see the reduction of relative violence. Even though we have the impression that there's been so much more violence in recent history because the mechanization of war and so forth. But actually, if you look at the actual number of people killed in sort of hunter-gatherer societies and wars, you have a much more violent society. You're much more likely to die from violence in those kind of societies than in our societies. So, so the argument, I think, goes something like there has objectively been a reduction of violence. And I think that Pinker's argument is that a variety of things, including the state and the sort of farming out to the third party regulator, as it were, in terms of conflict resolution, that all this has decreased selective pressures for aptitude or tendencies towards use of violence to resolve social problems. And it's sort of, this is the kind of selection process that is gradually, in the same way as you gradually took the foxes, gradually took the aggressiveness or violence out of human behavior. So I think we should explain that's whatever we could say about it critically is another thing, but I just thought we should lay that out.
Yeah, first. Thanks for doing that. That's a really important point. And I would just like to add to that. So the argument with human domestication is definitely that there has been a selection process against aggression. And I just like to also clarify that this is like a certain type of aggression. This is and I'm drawing a little bit on Richard Wrangham's research here. He called it reactive aggression, which is sort of like a hot, angry. This would feed into sort of like the fight or flight, the fight. This would be a different sort of aggression than what he called proactive aggression, which might be, a long, premeditated. It's not sort of an emotional, impulsive reaction where you get into a fight, maybe you kill someone. It would be selecting against that sort of aggression, as opposed to, humans obviously have still amazing capacity for violence, but it is sort of working on selecting against one particular type of aggression. And that we've also seen, so with the foxes, when you selected for tameness, you saw a suite of phenotypic changes. Now, obviously humans don't have like floppy ears and curly tails like you would see in farm animals, but
Speak for yourself.
But other phenotypic changes, like I think our heads, you can look in the archaeological record, our heads and brains have shrunk a bit. Our teeth are smaller. There's like a bunch of phenotypic things that seem to correlate with these sort of changes. I don't know if anybody has anything to add about that.
So you said the claim is that our reactive violence has been selected against. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And that has to do with like, I think like I'm not really an expert on like the brain chemistry. You can read, like Richard Wrangham has a new book out that's all about this stuff, but he sort of talked about like serotonin and the hypothalamus and all this stuff. And I am not familiar enough to really be able to put that argument back together, but.
Yeah. So in some of these animals, I don't remember the paper off the top of my head. I was a bit too jet lagged to kind of read it again, but there was a claim that with a number of these animals, there was an effect on the neural ridge, I think, that was related to domestication, and I think that's what was labeled as domestication syndrome. Is there any evidence that anything like that is happening in humans?
So let me just make sure that I understand what you're saying. I think that the process, so when you see sort of the smattering of changes in phenotype, the theory is that you're messing with something. And when I mean messing, I don't mean in a negative way. Just you're changing something in like the neural crest that all these traits seem to be. So to go back, your neural crest, when you're like a little ball of cells developing in your mom, it's like literally an empty ball of cells, and then they eventually differentiate and fill in, and you've got cells on the outside that become your skin, you've got cells on the inside that become like your guts, and then you've got this neural crest area that migrates and controls a number of things that develop through your body. So are you talking about, and so they suspect that the process of domestication, and when you select against aggression, it does something to the neural crest and migration. Is that sort of what you're talking about? Or because that's more of a process.
Yeah, so I was curious if a similar process has happened in humans, if there's any evidence for that.
No, I don't know.
Okay.
So
there probably is, but...
Let me throw in a couple of thoughts, and this is this is one of those classic topics where I'll have extremely strong opinions despite actually not really knowing very much about the subject. But
that's what makes our group so great. We all do that.
That never stops me, of course, right? So I guess two thoughts I would add, and I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about them. So first of all, I've always been suspicious of this comparison of humans to the fox, and this we've come across this in other books, right? Other people have made this kind of argument, and I mean, first of all, to me, it's a different selection process, right? It's what Darwin called artificial selection, and he spent a lot of time talking about artificial selection, and of course, the difference in artificial selection is that you're actually trying to funnel the variables in a particular direction. Now, unless you believe in intelligent design, if we're assuming that natural selection is a more or less random process, then there is no such funneling, right? Things may go in a certain direction because there's pressures, leaning in certain ways, but there's always going to be a mix of variables that are acting outside of that funnel. And so I don't think you're ever going to get the kind of focused effect. And if you're comparing domestication, if you're claiming human domestication and trying to compare it to the case of these foxes, I think that you're really comparing apples and oranges. So that's the first thing. Okay.
Can I talk about that point, or do you want to make your second point?
Okay, I'll hold the second point.
Okay. I think that that's an excellent point. And this is a lot of my problem that I have too with this idea of humans self-domesticating. It's one of the language that makes it seem like this is some sort of like thing we're doing to ourselves, when really I think that the proper way to think about it is just that selection has taken our strategy in a different direction. And one of the comparisons that I'd like to talk about with this is the difference between chimps and bonobos, because I think that there is a good argument to be made that bonobos have self-domesticated in that they've gone through the same process where selection has favored cooperation and sort of reduced aggression, as opposed to chimpanzees that didn't undergo that sort of selection pressure. And so you end up with two very different populations in behaviors and in
don't bonobos eat their children, or someone else's other bonobos' children?
I mean, I didn't say that they're like living in a peaceful utopia. I just said compared to chimps, they're much more cooperative. They voluntarily share food. Sometimes even with strangers, they play more. It's a matriarchal society instead of a patriarchal society. Whereas like chimps, it's kind of like, really patriarchal. They like physically and violently dominate the females. It's just like a completely different social structure. And some of the thinking with this is that when chimps and bonobos split off, I think it's like 2 million years ago from the common ancestor, they thought they ended up in two different geographic regions isolated from each other. And bonobos had much more sort of like food available to them, and there wasn't as much competition for that. So that environment shifted the selection pressure towards less aggression and more sort of like cooperative society.
I'm not sure though that we should be describing that as domestication or self-domestication. I mean, like that's simply different selective pressures, different ecological contexts, giving rise to different traits.
Right.
And you were making this point earlier that, I mean, of course you can debate the definition of domestication, but it does sound like it's something acting upon something else. You need a domesticator or something like that. So I just, I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, this is more than...
Yeah, my point is that the word self-domestication is wrong, and that you often have a shift in selection pressure against aggression, and that doesn't mean you're domesticated.
Yeah, exactly. That's yeah. I agree with that entirely.
Yeah. I probably didn't make that clear.
Yeah. No, but you just agree with you. I think I wasn't disagreeing with you. I was, but I do think that that a lot of people make the mistake though of a sort of describing as domestication or self-domestication any evolutionary context where there seems to be a reduction of aggression. And I do think that's conceptual.
Right.
to when we talk about humans. Now, I did want to make my second point, totally different point, but I mean, again, relevant to this question. I think that, and I don't know what role, I mean, my background politically leads me to be suspicious of the idea that the state did anything good in human development. But, maybe it did. All right. I'm willing to concede that's a possibility. But I think a far better explanation for the decrease of aggression among humans is actually the rise over the last several hundred increasingly complex, interconnected economies, market economies that depend upon voluntary relationships, depend upon cooperation, organizations that depend upon cooperation that are based upon voluntary membership. And I think these kind of things actually explain why, from a sort of phenotypic perspective, the more tame form of the human phenotype is being expressed. And I suspect that in any context where you found, and I haven't been following this closely, but I mean, as things have been collapsing in Venezuela, you've seen a lot more violent activity going on there. And if you went back there, like even 10 years ago, you would have thought, well, here's a reasonably well-functioning society with, I mean, it's despite socialist pretenses, I think still had, market economies and still had voluntary civic associations. But now as it falls apart, you're seeing the aggressive side come out. In fact, another example of this, I remember when I was a grad student in the 80s, that I would be reading, I was kind of on the left in those days, and I would be reading these things like New Socialist Review, and they'd be talking about Yugoslavia as sort of the epitome of the perfect sort of multicultural society, and how this was a model for what the future of the world was going to be. And of course, 10 years later, these former, these countries that arose out of the collapse of Yugoslavia were all mass murdering each other in farm fields all over that territory. So, the impression back in the 80s that this was a highly civilized society disappeared. So I think that it's particular kinds of economics specifically, but also social and cultural type institutions that make it more profitable for people to express a phenotype that is less aggressive. And if those institutions fall apart very quickly, find that elimination of violence hasn't gone actually so far away as it first appeared it did.
There's another example I've heard people say too. The comparison of the Vikings versus modern day Scandinavians, for example, right? So I mean, like the Vikings were basically gangsters on boats that went around like pillaging and murdering and stealing and extortion or whatever you want to call it. And now their descendants are pretty peaceful.
Well, that's a long time span, but I'm saying like within 10 years in the case of Yugoslavia, a remarkable turnaround.
Yeah.
Can I change the subject?
No.
No, I think you make a really good point. I want to loop back to just domestication and like an example of how I hear the term being used, see the term being used, and I'm just going to continue to grind my axe.
Go for it.
Because today is my show. All right.
That's right. You're in charge. Go on.
All right. So this is an example that I pulled up and sort of why I'm getting such a bee in my bonnet about this domestication question. As I thought I'd have an example that I would read to you guys. So this is a direct quote, but not from the same. It's from a couple of pages I pulled just for the sake of keeping things sort of a little bit shorter. So this is from the book Sapiens by Harari in chapter 5. So this is about humans and the agricultural revolution, specifically wheat. So I'll just going to read a short thing and we can talk about it. 10,000 years ago, wheat was just a wild grass, one of many, confined to a small range in the Middle East. Suddenly, within just a few short millennia, it was growing all over the world. According to the basic evolutionary criteria of survival and reproduction, wheat has become one of the most successful plants in the history of the earth. We did it by manipulating Homo sapiens to its advantage. This ape had been living a fairly comfortable life hunting and gathering until about 10,000 years ago, but then began to invest more and more effort in cultivating wheat. This completely changed their way of life. We did not domesticate wheat. It domesticated us. The word domesticate comes from the Latin domus, which means house. Who's the one living in the house? Not the wheat. It's the sapiens.
Yeah. I mean, that's, remember when I said there might be kind of like a mutualism going on between like human and animal and human and plant. So I mean, you could think of that as a kind of mutualism, but in terms of calling that domestication, I mean, you can come up with another definition of domestication, but
which apparently he does, which means you live in a house.
Yeah, yeah.
Definition, like
yeah, it's just yet another definition, right? And I mean, like, it's not saying these definitions are wrong. It's just like, okay, well, which definition are we talking about?
No, I'm gonna fully say that this is wrong.
Okay.
Like,
Yeah.
Like, this is a terrible definition. Like,
well, if you take it literally, I mean, he's making a lot out of this etymology of the word domesticated, domos, house, right? I mean, like the idea of house, is meant sort of under the controlled territory. Like, I mean, like the pigs don't live in the house, right? They live in the barn, right? So whatever, right? So I mean, like if we're growing something in a field, then you could say that's part of our house in that sense, right? That's what the term is meant to use. So clearly, we've domesticated the wheat, if you like. But having said that, there probably is something to the idea that that these things there's often a symbiotic relationship in these kind of things, right? I mean, the wheat does from this process, right?
Certainly.
And if there was in doing so, I suppose you could argue that it did tap into something niche with something about appetite or nutritional needs or whatever of who the idea of trying to control it and transfer it around the world. So if you're going to make a case there's a symbiosis here, I think that there's something there. Yeah, the extreme case that it's a wheat that domesticated humans, I do think that's silly, though. I think that's obviously wrong.
Well, exactly. It's just kind of like sensationalist, I would say, use of a word that doesn't really add anything to the argument. Yeah, if you want to talk, I completely agree with everything you said, Michael. If you want to talk about symbiotic relationships, but I mean, nature is littered. Like, most species rely on food sources. Like, nothing just sort of is existing on its own little island and not really like intimately interconnected with all the organisms around it. So I'm not sure what the I just don't think it's making any very useful point. It's just sort of trying to be sensationalist about
yeah. I mean, if it helps people think think about the relationship more symbiotically, that might have been a useful thing to say. But I think you're right that the intention was just to try and show how clever I am by reversing the relation.
Right. You're more gracious than I am, but I think that's probably wise. The last thing I just wanted to talk a little bit about domestication, and this is just completely a subtext that I get from the conversation, but it seems like humans are always trying to remove ourselves from nature. Like, there's this category of domesticated, of like animals we've sort of brought in to life with us, and they're different than, so humans exist outside of nature, and it's maybe sort of our domesticated animals. Do you guys think that this would be, and this is a lot of the problem that I have with the language of domestication, is I think that it makes, maybe not on a completely explicit level, but it makes it seem like there's some sort of dichotomy between things that are domesticated and maybe outside of nature or no longer wild or whatnot, that I don't think is a very helpful way of looking at the world.
Yeah. No. Okay. Go ahead, Charles.
I was going to say I agree that that's a very common way for humans to see it. That's, there's humans and there's like the world of non-humans, and I think with some cultures, also some human groups are divided. Like I think the Bushmen divided up. It's like I think it's like animals you can eat and animals you can't eat, and like us, right? And like with the Bushmen, I think some humans they consider like part of them, even if they're not Bushmen. But some humans they consider animals you can't eat, which is nice of them, of course. But yeah. I did want to make another point. I'm kind of going off
Sure.
on a bit of a tangent, and I don't know if this, when in the book you read, whether it mentioned this or not, but I remember reading when I was like looking over the tame silver fox, and that when the tame animals he would breed together to try to create more and more tame animals, but I think he also took the animals that had the fight, flight, or freeze response, and he bred those together also, and they seemed, I think they got more and more violence as time went on, or something like that.
They were super mean foxes. They definitely did that. Yeah.
That's kind of interesting. I also I think I remember reading that you could buy the tame versions of these silver foxes.
Yes, exactly. They sell them as pets now for a mere $8,000, which goes to fund their research. You can have one of these adorable little things in your house. If you go on YouTube and look at the videos of them, it is like sickening how cute they are. They can't stand it. Although, word to the warning, apparently fox pee is like literally the worst smelling pee that you can imagine. So maybe before you introduce one into your house.
No.
But they are supposedly lovely pets.
Okay. Okay. So I was just going to throw in one more thought on the, and we probably should start thinking about wrapping up actually, but I just wanted to throw one more thought in, and I'm not going to be able to really elaborate it at length. I should have anticipated that this could have come up, so I should have prepared. But for anyone who's interested, I'll put a link in the description below this to a video that I made on a different channel, The Biological Realist, where I made the case. I actually got the idea from a fellow named Jean-Francois Guerespé, who I heard make it in a debate, which is basically that, and he was arguing with a vegan, and the vegan, of course, making this case about how horrible we are, how horrible life is for farm animals, and he made the point that humans have turned farm animals into the most successful eusocial species on the planet. Right, is that you've got this small number of kind of like the kings or the queens that we sort of have identified as the good breeders that we use to breed, and the rest of them are effectively workers who are looking after the breeders, and the way they're looking after the queen and king rather, and the way in which they look after them is by becoming the food that incentivizes us to maintain the good status and the good health care and good nutrition for the kings and the queens, and being highly successful eusocial animals. So just going back to your point, Patricia, about how assuming that anything that comes under the domain of humans ceases to be natural or subject to natural processes, though that might be a fairly extreme form of argument to make the point, nature doesn't disappear. It's not absent in humans. It's not absent in human relationships with other animals. These are just different kinds of relationships. And if you want to use the same kind of frameworks and tools that you use in the rest of ecology and evolutionary science, you can find the same kind of dynamics taking place. So.
Yes. Although I do have some things to say about the vegan thing. I don't think we need to go down that rabbit hole today. But that would be an interesting argument. I actually don't agree with anything you said about eusociality. I would just think
actually, you know what, we should actually have one of that, because I mean, believe I kind of, in a sense, I believe it, and whether it's true or not, I think that it's a valuable argument to have to try and get us outside of the sort of simplistic thinking that informs a lot of these sort of discussions around domestication of animals and whether or not that's natural and what that means to I don't know, an evolutionary ecological analysis. So I would actually like to have that episode.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Just one more point. Yes. Michael, when you were kind of getting in or kind of hinting at that animals being on a farm or interacting with humans in this way, whether for food or for labor or something, it actually helps the animal's fitness in a lot of ways. One example of this is the horse, right? Like before the car, horses were very, very common. I mean, there were, as I understand it, there were problems due to people using horses for transportation. Like there was horse manure everywhere, apparently. And the car was seen to solve that problem. I mean, car introduced other problems, but it was seen to solve that problem. But after the car was introduced, like, where are all the horses, right? There's not horse populations like we had before. So it does seem it does help their fitness in a way. Now you could debate like whether their standard of living is good or not. I mean, that's another type of way, but like in terms of just fitness, in terms of the number of descendants, like it does seem to help.
Yeah, this is something that people like Rothbard make the point all the time, right? There's no problem, there's no danger of any species disappearing that humans have an economic interest in, right?
Yeah, so what you're saying is like find all the animals that are endangered and start eating them.
Yeah, that's right. Create it. Yeah, that's right. Find some kind of human use for any endangered species, and it will cease to be endangered very quickly.
Yeah, have people someone's gonna like
I was like, you guys are gonna get PETA after us.
Yeah. I was just kind of wondering, for the good of rhinos, do people eat rhinos?
No, they like the horn. Actually, they grind up the horns and sometimes use them in like medicinal medicine. So they don't eat any of the rhino. I think it's the horns that are
why don't they breed them to make more horns then? Like, is it difficult to get rhinos to mate?
So actually you can't domesticate everything. One of the findings of the fox experiment is like we've tried to domesticate like zebras and a number of animals. And so I think that the argument is that it tends to work better with animals. So dogs came from wolves that were highly social. And they seem that because they've got sort of that social wiring in their genes already, that it's easier to sort of accumulate these traits. But one of the things with domestication is you can't domesticate every animal, and that these traits have to be there in their genotype already. And it's sort of about accumulating them and getting them to be expressed, as opposed to, and this was one of Balyev's hypothesis, that it wasn't necessarily about new mutations that were happening and then you were hanging on to. It was about traits that were already existing in like the population of a species, and that you were accumulating those in some organisms.
Yeah, but just to say it explicitly, I mean, sometimes within a population on the farm, like say cattle or something like that, you do try to get new mutations, right? Like I think farmers they at least have a belief that if you want like some kind of characteristic to rise, have a large herd, for example, right? And eventually you'll get some characteristic, and it might be problematic at first, but you can breed eventually for like different things that way. So I mean, like sometimes it does seem like you're taking advantage of new mutations, whatever the kind of mutation is necessarily. Like
certainly, but just the fact that they were able to domesticate a new species in like 60 odd years shows that it wasn't like always relying on waiting for new mutations, that these were traits that were already existed.
Was it? Maybe. I mean,
yeah, that's what this book, or the conclusion it comes to, that these were things that were already there in the population, and like in the genotype, and it was a matter of breeding to express these traits.
Yeah, I think they also use the same method in some other animals. I kind of remember a rat. I kind of remember a snake, but maybe not. But I remember reading, and I couldn't find the paper. I actually tried searching for it in my Twitter feed. I don't know where it is, but I remember that someone applied the same technique to different animals, and they were able to exhibit like a suppression of the fight, flight, or freeze response. And also I think these animals also their coloration changed.
Right.
This also I don't remember what the animals were, but I think one of them was a rat.
Yeah, you can with some species, but some there just doesn't exist that like diversity of behaviors to capitalize on, right?
Maybe they're not trying hard enough.
Yeah, I'm curious. You're wrapping up, but I'm so are they convinced, Patricia, that mutation did not play a role in what happened with the foxes.
There's just no way that you would get like I mean, we're not talking about enough generations. You might get a mutation here or there, but like in order to have that drastic an outcome in literally 60 years.
Well, it depends, right? I mean, you would not expect to have a complex adaptation get created in 60 years, right? But you can do simple things, right? Like you can break something, or you can exaggerate it, or like change the timing for the developmental timings of different things, right? So I mean, like for example, like think of lactase persistence that allows lactose tolerance in adults, like so for organisms to be able to digest the sugar in milk as an adult. So I mean that adaptation already exists. Like all mammals have it, but in some humans, I think about a third of the population.
But I mean, you're not going to get you're not going to get a mutation like that in like 60 generations. Well, and you're not going to have it like through all the population.
It depends.
But you could get it in one generation.
Yeah, I mean, but it also
you get it in one generation in one individual.
Yeah, but it depends also how complex it is to get that trait, right? Like if it's just think like skin pigmentation. If it's just a matter of breaking a gene, you could break that gene a lot of different ways, right? And if you get an organism that has it broken, that's like, okay, well, you have that. Okay. And maybe there's a couple genes involved. Maybe the other one gets broken eventually. I mean, those are just simple mutations.
But in the case of the foxes, the fact that it resembled dogs so much in the outcome, I would say that like it's highly unlikely that they just happen to get the same mutation at the same time to get the same outcome. Like it's more, it seems to me like, I mean, yes, anything's possible. It could be, but I just think it's very unlikely.
But all I was asking, so there's no actual genetic evidence to back that up. They're just making a logical deduction in this number of generations. We wouldn't expect it.
Are geneticists. I mean, I can go back and read their exact papers, but like the people doing this experiment are geneticists, so I'm inclined to take their word for it.
Oh no, it's not a question of word. I'm just trying to find out what the evidentiary claim was. That's all.
Yeah, I just
you have to read the book, Michael.
But I thought that I wanted to be able to live off of your hard work. Actually,
I think I did a pretty good job.
Good job. I just wanted to see if I could get more out of it. That's all.
There was just one other thing I wanted to say. I saw at one point there was something floating around Twitter. I was busy, I think, with work, so I never kind of read the paper on this or found out where the paper was. I remember there being a claim that dogs had Williams syndrome. So Williams syndrome in humans, it seems to be something that makes people hypersocial and give them like extraordinary musical talents. And when they talk, it's very melodic, but it seems to be nonsense. And I think it can be caused by a single deletion of a certain part of the genome. It might be able to be caused in different ways too. And there's even some people think that the old stories of elves were individuals with Williams syndrome, like the kind of facial characteristics that people with Williams syndrome have seem to match up with the elves, and also the behavioral talents they describe with elves seems to match up with Williams syndrome, which is kind of interesting. But there's a claim I remember like seeing on Twitter, like there was a claim that that maybe dogs have Williams syndrome, which is kind of interesting. I don't know if there's anything to that. I just thought I'd throw it out and provide nothing to back it up.
Yeah, no, I think I've heard, they might have talked a little bit about something, because that vaguely rings a bell with me too. And I don't know if that's because maybe you'd spoken about this before or because I read it somewhere. But yeah, no, I think that there's going to be like a lot of interesting research and theories and stuff that is going to come out of these studies, for sure.
Yeah. Maybe the Siberian foxes have Williams syndrome.
They very well, like, I actually feel like it may be talked about something, because one of the things that the foxes do a lot is they get way more vocal, and they would be like kind of always like yapping and chirping, which like foxes very rarely do in the wild, so, or even in captivity. But anyways, last plug for the book, How to Tame a Fox. It's fabulous. Highly recommend. Go adopt a fox, maybe. I hear they destroy your house, but
and the peace
support research.
All right. Excellent.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for indulging me in my love of the Soviet fox experiment, I guess Russian fox experiment, whatever we can call it. It's a really, really good book. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Patricia. That was great.
All right. I'll chat again soon, guys.
Okay, see you.
Bye.
Okay.